Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm the Omni viewer, and I'm here to expand on a couple of things that I talked about over on TwitX, but I felt like I could probably make a proper video about them here. This is one part rumor control, and actually a follow-up on an old bit of news that I've been talking about for years now, it seems. I'm gonna start with something involving the Monsterverse. Now, you may recall, if you've been following the channel for long enough, or you've just been following the Godzilla fandom and the Monsterverse side of things for long enough, that there's been a lot of debate about what exactly the right status is, like the nature of the deal between Legendary and Godzilla. Because for quite a while, it was thought that Godzilla was not going to be part of the Monsterverse after a certain point. And in fact, the Monsterverse might end at that point. It went something like this. People noted that there hadn't been any particular movie announced for after Godzilla vs. Kong, which didn't necessarily mean anything on its own. Then they took into account an interview with Shinji Higuchi, one of the two directors behind Shin Godzilla, and how he spoke about when he and Hideaki Anno were talking to Toho and negotiating and everything. Toho said that they had to make the movie within a certain time frame, and they did not want it to be released in like 2020. It had to be made before 2019-2020 era. Now, the reasonable assumption to make from that particular interview is that Toho had the American movies going, they were going to make their own homegrown movie, and they didn't want them released so close together that they would wind up interfering with each other and thus wind up making their own competition. I mean, that would just be bad business practice if that happened, so you want the one movie to be made in a certain amount of time so it doesn't interfere with the others, right? Well, instead, a lot of people assumed that this was somehow him saying that the Legendary's rights to Godzilla were going to expire in 2020, later moved to 2021 due to extenuating circumstances, and that the rights would then revert back to Toho so they could keep making their own movies. Please ignore the fact that they're already making their own movies because they didn't actually lose the rights. Now, I was always of the opinion that this didn't actually mean what people thought it meant. Sure, there was no movie announced for immediately after Godzilla vs. Kong, but maybe they were just taking it slow. What Shinji Higuchi said didn't sound to me like it had anything to do with the rights reverting, but people were insistent. And obviously now we live in an age where we are past Godzilla vs. Kong, and Godzilla has stayed in the Monsterverse. He has a strong American presence and a strong Japanese presence. And it seems like we're going to be getting two different Godzilla series side by side from both sides of the Pacific. Which is actually what we already had, because Toho had Shin Godzilla, and then they licensed him out to do the Polygon trilogy and Godzilla Singular Point. But you know, whatever. Apparently those didn't count when people thought that Toho had somehow lost the rights and couldn't make more movies unless they reverted back and America could no longer make their own. Well, an article, or an excerpt from an article, because it's behind a paywall, was recently posted on TwitX. And if it's accurate, and I would think that it is, that actually clears up what the deal is. It would seem that the agreement between Toho and Legendary is that Legendary has what is referred to as rolling rights, which means as long as they're regularly producing content with Godzilla in it, they retain the license. It's kind of like what Marvel did with their characters prior to establishing their own studio. They would sell the license to different characters to different studios, but it was always kind of assumed. I don't know if anyone ever actually confirmed the details of it, but it was generally accepted that if a studio didn't make stuff with that character within a certain amount of time, the rights would revert back to Marvel. This famously is why Joshua Trank's Fan-Force Stick exists. Not because Joshua Trank had a particularly stunning vision of the Fantastic Four, we now know that he really didn't, but it was more because Fox didn't want the rights to revert back to Marvel, so they just made the movie purely to retain it. So now we know that's the deal with Godzilla. As long as Legendary is still making content with Godzilla, they essentially retain the rights to use him. And if they ever stop, or if too much time passes without them making something, then they lose the license. Which means all that stuff about the rights reverting back to Toho and expiring at a certain point was never true. It was always a false rumor that was being spread around. And now that we actually have some confirmation of that, I'm feeling kind of vindicated. One of the things I actually said early on was that somebody should just ask what the deal is. Like, reach out to Legendary and say, what is the nature of your agreement? How long do you have the Godzilla license? As far as I can tell, nobody actually did until apparently just now, which is kind of stunning to me. Maybe people didn't want to know because there was a chance they might be wrong. But either way, now we know. As long as Legendary continues the Monsterverse with Godzilla in it, then Godzilla is going to remain at Legendary. But that doesn't prevent Toho from making their own stuff, as we've seen, or licensing them out to other companies in Japan. That could mean Godzilla is going to appear in Monarch's Legacy of Monsters Season 2, mind you. The current scuttlebutt is that it is going to be more Kong-focused, but if this really is the nature of the deal, they'll probably find a way to work Godzilla in somehow. Although that's just speculation on my part, and I can't say it for certain. Either way, at least now we know what the deal is. Speaking of licenses and rights and whatnot, there's another bit of news going around involving the licensing of another monster, or at least the potential licensing. It has been reported that, as we speak, Sony is in talks to purchase Kadokawa. Now, you might hear that and think, what does that have to do with kaiju? You may recall, however, that a few years ago, Kadokawa purchased the rights to Gamera, and I believe other Daiei properties, that would also include Daimajin if I recall correctly, but Gamera was the big deal. And of course, Kadokawa was behind the recent anime Gamera Rebirth that debuted on Netflix. Now, kaiju fans are looking at that bit of news and thinking, if the deal goes through, that means Sony would have access to everything in Kadokawa's catalog, including Gamera, so maybe they could make a Gamera movie? I mean, I know the last time Sony had the rights to a Japanese giant monster of popular origin, it didn't exactly go over well, but that was back in 1998. This is a new age. They could probably get Gamera right, especially since now we have a very clear template of how to properly do kaiju movies on both sides of the Pacific. So, I've heard that news, and I just want to say, I wouldn't hold my breath. First of all, as of this posting, Sony has not actually acquired Kadokawa just yet. There are negotiations happening, but the actual deal has not happened. No contracts have been signed, no hands have been shaken. Admittedly, that might wind up being outdated if you're watching this in the future and the deal does go through, but right now, it hasn't. However, let's suppose for a moment that the deal does go through, and Sony does wind up purchasing Kadokawa, and that is now under their umbrella. I don't think that Gamera is very high on their priority list. Kadokawa is mostly known for being an anime company. They have other stuff, but it's mostly known for its anime. And I think that's what Sony is really interested in, because anime and manga, they've been doing pretty well recently, outclassing a lot of American-made properties. So Sony is probably looking to make this deal specifically so they can have all that anime, and they can start making use of that in physical sales, streaming, and yes, even cable, which is still around despite having supposedly been killed a few years ago by streaming. That's probably what they're prioritizing, and anything else they might get is gravy. They might do something with it, or they might shelve it, or they might start selling it off to other companies. We don't know at this point, but I have a feeling that Gamera would be in that latter category. Think of it kind of like when Disney bought Star Wars. And no, I did not misspeak just then. I know that on paper they bought Lucasfilm and LucasArts, but really all they wanted was Star Wars, and Star Wars has been given the priority ever since that purchase. I mean, really, what else have they done? An Indiana Jones movie and a Willow series on Disney+, both of which were so terrible and nobody likes them. Willow was in fact deleted. And what else have they done? Well, part of the deal was gaining LucasArts, which has a whole bunch of video game titles under its belt, Or I should say it did, because one of the first things Disney did after the purchase was to dissolve LucasArts and start licensing out their properties to other game companies. And by other properties, I naturally mean Star Wars, because that's all they wanted. Anything else they might have gotten from Lucasfilm and LucasArts didn't matter to them, clearly, as history has shown. I'm thinking that Sony's eyeing of Kadokawa and wanting to acquire it is very similar. They're probably looking at the anime titles and a few popular anime in particular, and not really overly concerned with the rest. Unfortunately, Gamera is probably under the rest category. Now, I could be wrong. It could be that somebody in Sony is a huge kaiju fan and realizes that they will have access to Gamera and might have plans in store specifically for the turtle to have a big blockbuster that can compete with the Monsterverse. We don't know at this point. Like I said, the deal hasn't actually even gone through yet. It's just being considered. There are negotiations happening, but nothing has happened as of yet. So at this point, we don't know what might happen with Gamera in the future. But I guess we'll find out one way or the other. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off.